Hey BookTube, today I am talking about The Great God Pan by Arthur Machen, which probably are not going to be able to see this at all. It is a frontispiece of, indeed, The Great God Pan, with an illustration by Aubrey Beardsley. Audrey Beardsley, I think it's Beardsley, who is the great artist, illustrator, best known probably for his association with Oscar Wilde and just sort of the whole decadence and movement and aestheticism and paganism. A lot of Beardsley's work is definitely this is a satyr with horns and is known for his like kind of erotic kind of Japanese, kind of Oriental influence, and I use Oriental in a advised tone of Orientalism of the time, how that was sucked up by the English Empire. But yes, okay, I'm talking about The Great God Pan, which is a fantasy horror novel, which is actually this is sort of my spin-off from Pentathon of the Lovecraft, because Lovecraft, in that video that I did on Lovecraft of the Terror Red Hook and the Dunwich horrors, I'd read in Wikipedia that, Arthur Machen, and specifically The Great God Pan, this novella, was a big influence on him of the Lovecraftian idea of an ancient evil that underlies everything. He kind of gotten this from Machen, so it's like, this is one of these cool things you can kind of go back. And the good thing with something like Arthur Machen, The Great God Pan was published in its full novella form in 1894. It's all for free, and I like for free, and I like novellas because they're also short, so I can kind of read them through. And actually, this is one that I read through and I listened through, because there's also a great Librivox version of this multiple times, because I found it very, very fascinating. I'm going to start off here because there's a good key bit of the horror, which is all about how there's a bunch of like just London men who seem very stable and wealthy, affluent London men who kill themselves unexpectedly, suicide. And I do find that the part of this kind of thing, the suicide part, has sort of drawn me in a way, is like, this is the kind of the hook. This is the terror. This is the sort of key core terror of this book, at least my reading of it at the moment. And I know that suicide is something that can sometimes, when you're not in your best of frames, is something you want to avoid. I know that in my own life, suicide is played a part in my life of a close family member who did kill themselves. So I invite anyone who's just not in that mood today, you can toddle off if you want. That's totally good. But yes, let me get into The Great God Pan, which it's when I first read this, when I was first starting reading this, is like, is this actually a collection of short stories? Because the first one opens with like, there's a scientist, Dr. Raymond, and he's invited his friend over to watch him do this surgery on this poor, innocent Victorian girl, Mary, and he pops open the back of her head and turns her into an idiot. She's like, it's like, apparently he was doing the operation because you just have to remove a little bit, and suddenly it'll pull back the veil and you'll see what's actually there underneath. However, I didn't kind of understand that, the human mind can't actually do that. So I proved my experiment, except, poor Mary there is just complete, is turned into an idiot as the thing. And I'm like, okay. And then we go on to a next story, and the next story doesn't seem to have anything connection to the first story, and they're just like, what the heck's going on here? And it's only as you go through the chapters it starts to coalesce, and you start to think, oh my god, it is actually all connecting together, that characters from one story go into the next one, and that it's actually building towards something, which gives this an actually kind of a lovely. Victorians were all about kind of like, I found this manuscript and now I'm presenting it to you as a kind of a fictional framing device. And there's a part of this which is like, the very end of the book is indeed, it's called Fragments, and it's all these different documents that it's like there's some kind of deep horrible terror that not one person was able to hold in their mind. So we have to kind of assemble it together at the very end. And so this is when they talk about The Great God Pan, it's because that they refer to basically being able to see the underneath is this, oh, that's someone who has seen the great god Pan. This kind of, and it's like it's overwhelming kind of intense nature in a way, but it's also it seems to be malevolent. I think this is where we get into the kind of the Lovecraftian thing of this is a malevolence underneath, and that's the terror. Um, but it's interesting because it becomes embodied in a woman, Helen Vaughn, who seems to kind of catch men in her grip and shows them unspeakable depravities, which of course we won't speak of. We'll just leave it up to your imagination to put in all the depravities that you can think of, and it drives them. It drives them to the thing, and suddenly they go from being a very stable, happy, successful bachelors to being to suddenly committing suicide. And it's interesting because there's this whole thing of in the Victorian age of the views of suicide. It's like I think it was like 1823. I did some reading up on this. 1823 is when they actually outlawed the whole idea of suicides had to be should be they outlawed the practice of burying suicides at crossroads, driving a stake through their heart. That's interesting, which is kind of to me is a vampire thing, and dousing them in lime. It's like the traffic over top of them, all the people walking over top of them was supposed to keep their restless ghosts down. Which isn't to say that even though they kind of outlawed that, we did get into kind of progressivism. This is definitely Victorian. We're wrestling with all this stuff and we're trying to figure out different ideas, but it was still the idea of a sort of a moral failing, a moral weakness, a depravity of being a sinner, the ultimate sin. I mean, you get the sort of thing, you get that with like Dante of like, suicides were one of the levels of hell. And indeed, still in this time period, it's definitely was one of these like, this isn't someone who should be given a state funeral if they're a rich man. And indeed, before a certain point, I think before the 1823 law came in, if you were declared a suicide, theoretically that your lands and all your stuff was forfeit, and the government could take it all, which of course meant that, funnily enough, it seemed only like poor people got declared suicides, and they made great efforts to make sure that rich men, it wasn't going to interfere with the transmission of their wealth to their heirs. So that it was one of these kind of paradoxical laws of it actually made it easier for rich men to still get away with suicide, which is, man, that's that one of those twisted things. And it's interesting. I am talking about it. There's male and female suicide. I did read books on. I did read little articles on like sort of the idea of like how masculinity sort of changed over the Victorian era from kind of an earnestness and spirituality to kind of the idea of a tough man, a man who doesn't cry, and which is something that's definitely come forward in that, and that kind of masculinity that's like very hard on the very hard. Well, it's also hard on all the people around the males. It's also it's hard on the males themselves, and you get just sort of the idea of men killing themselves for variety of reasons. After when I started reading this, The Great God Pan, I was like, oh, okay, is this a part of kind of the idea of with like kind of Oscar Wilde of men who are engaged in activities which were forbidden in the society. So it's like being a gay man in the society and stuff like that. And a part of that may be alluded to. This book got condemned for implied terrible sexual practices, and some part of it is you wonder, oh, is this like they won't name the acts that won't be named, and one of the acts that won't be named, the love that dare not speak its name, which is the idea of same-sex love. So there's that, which is interesting because there's also this idea with Helen Vaughn is, spoiler alert, she carries this great god Pan with her of being a polymorphous perverse of not only being female but also being male and also being bestial, which has got some interesting echoes in my mind to when people get upset about the idea of about same-sex unions as the people going, oh, well, next thing you know, we're going to talk about bestiality, which is like, oh, okay. And so we've got Helen Vaughn here who can be male, female, and beast, which is like, that to me that can kind of speak to me of the same anxiety of that. So the Great God Pan, I enjoyed this book. I enjoyed this book in that it was so fragmentary, and it was like you're putting together the pieces, and you're jumping from character to character. So yes, it's interesting there's a kind of a base thing there of Lovecraft, of kind of the idea of kind of the ancient evil, but like, all things, the ancient evils can be, racism, fear of other, maybe in Lovecraft. And there's some other, ancient evils here, or not so ancient evils of societal views on masculinity, on sexuality, and stuff like that. So, yeah, that's my natter about The Great God Pan by Arthur Machen. Definitely worth to check out. I'll put the links below to the Guttenberg and the Librivox, the audio and the e-version, since I don't have a paper version of this, as good books that just tap into that another part of thing. And it's funny, as someone who when I come up against contemporary works that kind of deal with suicide, a lot of times I find them very I'm not sure, I don't want to say word triggering, but I find they end up making me feel worse rather than better about me trying to kind of wrap my mind around how suicide has affected my life. Whereas something like this, where it's the Great God Pan, somehow that's a better way for me to be able to process this stuff, and hopefully still to deal with the stuff, but not to just kind of curl myself up into a ball and be like, bleh. So I guess that's my plea for fantasy for today, of how it helps certain people out there in their lives. So that's all I have to say. My nervous laugh at the end. More videos later.